Okay, so this is the Bible study for the first Sunday after Christmas, and it's our Advent series, but obviously Advent is looking forward to Christmas, and this is actually after Christmas, but I want to stay with the liturgical calendar for a couple more weeks, at least through Epiphany, and just kind of go along with the story and the time that we're celebrating right now. And so in the beginning, and you can download this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. It'll be in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. And at the top of the Bible study, it says, we've been talking for a month about Advent and the expectation of the coming of the Messiah. Yesterday, we celebrated his arrival. Today, we talk about one of the few stories we have from Jesus's early life. And that is in Luke chapter 2, verse 41. It says, every year, Jesus's parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So number one in our Bible study says, what do we learn in verse 41 that sets the backdrop for this text? So verse 41 says, every year Jesus's parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. So this sort of sets the backdrop. The story is more about Jesus than it is about his parents. But you know, we're moving on from the birth story, and we're moving on in time order, and there's some transitions that are needed for us to understand. And so we needed to understand that this is not a one-time deal, that this was common for them. They probably did it every year before and after Jesus's birth, but certainly in the last 12 years they've been doing this. So it's not like just one day they decided to go to Jerusalem. This was their custom. This is what they normally did. And on one occasion when they did that, happens to be when Jesus was 12 years old, this is something that happened that was of note and is being shared in Luke's gospel. So number two says, is our celebration and recognition of the things God has done for us as consistent? Yes, no, explain. So we just celebrated Christmas. Perhaps you're, now let me just say this. I'm not talking about, it's hard because Jewish culture was so centered around religious celebrations. And so it's very easy for us to read this and think of our Christmas traditions or our Easter traditions or our whatever Thanksgiving traditions. and think about holiday traditions from a cultural perspective more than we think about spiritual significance and spiritual celebrations. And so let me just say this, that as a kid, I was in a small country church, and our church did not often, in fact, a lot of times the pastor was living far from his family. And so my guess is that they spent a lot of those years. I don't remember exactly why, and I wasn't mature enough to understand or know why it was that we didn't do certain things and we did other things. But I know this: our church growing up, I don't remember a time when they ever had a Christmas Eve or Christmas Day service. And our traditions growing up, even though we were consistently committed to the church, our Christmas traditions centered way more around family and celebrations in living rooms than worship services and things like that. So I know that we did have the tradition of my dad reading the Christmas story out of his Bible on Christmas morning before we could open presents and things like that. So we did have Christmas traditions that were spiritual, but I would say that I know this. I know that it's very easy for us to feel like if the church schedules a Christmas Eve service or a Christmas Day service or something, it's very easy for us to think, hey, um, um, that kind of interferes with my plans for Christmas that I have with my family. And then we choose to do the plans that we have instead. Let me just be really clear that I wrote this and I'm recording this before our Christmas Eve service and before any of our Christmas festivities at the church. So I'm not recording this and teaching this to address anything that I've seen that's wrong, or somebody that did something, and I don't even know that anybody will, that I disagree with. So let me just be clear about that. That's not what this is about at all. But I'm trying to think in terms of, do we have spiritual commitments with regard to the celebrations in the Christian calendar that mark things that God has done for us? So I think Easter, even though there's still Easter eggs and bunnies and things like that, it does seem like Easter is way more commonly seen as, I guess, perhaps the overall consumer markets have not figured out how to latch on to Easter at the level that they have held on to Christmas at this point. So Easter maybe is more clearly a Christian holiday that we go to church for and celebrate. But it seems like Christmas, we sometimes perhaps our traditions are more important than the celebrations together as a body of Christ, is what I'm saying. So the reason that I'm talking about all of that is that their celebrations were consistent, and it became their family tradition. It was celebrating what God had done for them. The Passover was a significant holiday for Jews in the salvation that God had brought from the death angel, which was connected with deliverance from slavery in Egypt. And that story and what God had done for them hundreds, perhaps even more many, many years ago, in their people was such a priority that no matter where you lived, you traveled back to Jerusalem, and that was a part of your family's celebration of what God had done. And so they made it a big deal, and it was something that really just wasn't questioned, and it was something that was consistent. And I feel like religious celebrations today take a backseat, maybe not even second place, but clear at the rear of anything else that we have planned. And so that's, I guess, a comparison that I want to make. I don't think that's the primary purpose of writing this text. I don't think if I was to pick a primary message that I think God is speaking through this text, I don't think that's it. But I do think it's really good when we're putting ourselves into the story to actually see how we compare. So we always try to, in our Bible studies, put ourselves into the story and apply the things that are talked about to our lives. And so that seems appropriate to me in this case. Number 3, when, according to verses 42 and 43, does the story take place? A, when Jesus was 12 years old. B, during the festival, specifically the festival of the Passover, which is not said in 42 and 43, it's said in 41, but then it's referred back to the festival in verse 42. C, well, actually, most of the story takes place after the festival was over. So that's an interesting thought about this, right? The story that's being told is not so much about their celebration of the festival, but of this funny thing that happened when the festival was over and everybody's traveling home. And so that's when it happened. And it was when Jesus was 12 years old. And that makes this story somewhat unique because we have very little stories, very few stories about Jesus' childhood. So number 4 says what happened in verses 44 through 46. Well, apparently Jesus' family left without him, and that's true. B, Jesus' family thought he was with them, so they must have been traveling in a large group of family and friends. So there would have been many, many people from all over the area that had traveled to Jerusalem. Many of them would have been leaving Jerusalem at the same time by the same road. Some of them would have been going to the same places. Some of them might have been going to places that were closer. It's hard for us to imagine, given that we drive today, and maybe we leave this someplace together and we're driving and we're following, and then one person turns off and they beep and wave or something like that on their way when they turn off. But just imagine if you're walking and perhaps carrying your belongings on an animal of some sort or whatever, but mostly everybody's walking, and you're traveling and everybody was on the same road. How that would be, how you would pass the time, maybe I shouldn't say this, but these days I can watch something or listen to something as I drive down the road. Listening to something's okay. I think watching something is probably frowned upon, but someday the car's going to drive for me, I guess, and then I can watch something. But we have something to pass the time. Well, what would they have been doing? Well, they would have been probably talking and continuing to fellowship along the way, and kids would have been playing as they went along, probably. And the kids would go over there and the parents would go over here, and everybody's on the same road. And the only time probably that anybody would really stop to say, okay, we see all the kids are over there, they're fine, it's okay, we're not gonna make them walk next to us. But then when we stop for the night, perhaps when some of the families are starting to turn off and go that way and others are going this way, well, now's a good time to stop and say, no, where's Jesus? Where did our son go? And so they were a day into the journey before they seemed to have stopped to check, because they were traveling with a large group of people. And these were family and friends, and they weren't worried about the safety because they were all in a group and the kids were all together, and everybody they were traveling with was people they knew and trusted. And so it wasn't, they didn't check. It seems weird to us today, although nearly everybody, especially now these days they call CYFD on you, I think, but nearly everybody in my dad's generation has a story of being left behind, especially if they were a child of a family with multiple kids. Really easy to jump in the car, start driving down the road, look in the rear view and realize I don't hear as much arguing as normal, and realize you left one of your kids behind. Um, my dad had a vacation story like that. I even one of our friends told a story about that when their child fell asleep in church, and they had 4 or 5 children, and they got all the way home before they realized one wasn't there, and she was still asleep on the front pew of the church. That's really common among pastors who live in a parsonage next door, actually, because um, kids will often run home, and once they get a certain age anyway, ahead of the parents. And so the parents don't realize till they get home that after a while they hadn't seen one of their kids. They go walk back, and sure enough, they're asleep in the church, and the church is all locked up. So um, those kinds of things can happen. But it seems appalling to us that they were a day into the journey, because we really feel like if we were going to go on a trip like that, we would have checked a little better. But we're also viewing things from the thought process of loading everybody up in the car, as opposed to starting to walk in a large group of people, all of whom you pretty much trust with your kids. So it was a different situation. When his family couldn't find him, this is C, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. That's true. And then D, even when his family returned to Jerusalem, it took them 3 days searching around the city to find him. So think about this. Think about a situation where a child has been left behind, and the parents get a day journey out, which meant it would have been a day journey back. Perhaps they walked a little faster on the way back. And then 3 days they're searching, and they're from a small town. So this is a large city, probably not compared to what we would think of as a large city, but they're on foot looking, and there's house to house. He had to sleep somewhere last night, and there's businesses and markets and buildings, and they're searching around for him, asking people if they've seen him and that sort of thing. In 3 days, they're searching. So if they searched for 3 days, which was what I think I'm reading here, and they were a day out when they realized they had left him, that means 5 days Jesus had been with out his family. And when they find him, he does not seem alarmed, but they do. So number 5 says, where was Jesus when they found him? And he was in the temple, it says, in the temple courts, which was a public area. The church today doesn't have really a good equated room or building, but the temple courts were probably more like fellowship halls. They were areas around the primary worship area, and they were concentric. So there were inner courts and outer courts, and they were. We read as Jesus is an adult about some of them becoming markets, and that concerned him. Some of them only allowed men, some of them only allowed Jews. And the further out you got, the more likely it was that everybody would have been allowed. But they were gathering areas that a lot of interactions would happen, and people would sit in groups and discuss the word of God and things like that. So that's where he was. He was in the temple courts. What was he doing? It says he was listening to them. He was asking questions, and they apparently were listening to him too. But that's in verse 46 there. And then what does verse 47 tell us about the people who were listening to him? It says everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So it was really common for learning to happen by people asking each other questions and suggesting answers, and then somebody asking questions that challenge that answer, and sort of a back and forth. And so for somebody to be able to interact that way with religious leaders suggests that they have some understanding, because um, you know otherwise, how would you even know a good question to ask? And then when they ask a question back to you, then if you give a good answer, or ask another question that's associated with that, then it shows understanding, and it tells us that they were amazed. Number 6 says, why do you think they were amazed? And then it says, see also Matthew 7:29. Well, he was 12. So in general, a 12-year-old talking to religious leaders in a way that they understand each other just does really seem pretty impressive. B, the religious leaders had been through extensive training in the scriptures. It is not clear if his answers were amazing because they exceeded the teachers, which is perhaps what sometimes we assume, or simply because they displayed remarkable wisdom for his age. But either way, it was clear that Jesus was different from other 12-year-olds. So they were amazed at his answers. That doesn't necessarily mean that as a 12-year-old he was teaching them, although we sometimes assume that. Perhaps that's what it meant. But it's also possible that he exceeded other 12-year-olds and understood things that a 12-year-old shouldn't understand, and that in and of itself was remarkable. Now, Matthew 7:29 is referenced in the question, and that says, and we can say 28 and 29. 28 says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Verse 29, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And so other people, and this is when Jesus was an adult and Jesus was talking and teaching the crowds, they noted that he taught as someone with authority rather than as somebody who the way the teachers of the law taught, which the assumption is without authority. There's a distinction, there's a contrast here. And so the tendency is for somebody to teach something that belongs to somebody else. So it's very easy. I experienced this at some level, and I don't think this is the same thing, but it's something that's a similar idea. I feel like I preached different when I was on staff in our church than I preach as pastor. Now, that's not because, part of it might be because I got better, I had more practice, but I also believe that when the congregation was mine to shepherd, that I now didn't have to worry that I was saying something that Pastor Bain wouldn't agree with, or didn't have to worry about. I just had to worry about being right with God and saying what God's told me to say, and not second guessing myself all the time. Now, I would argue that some of our staff, I think, preach with authority in a way that I don't think I did when I was on staff. And I'm grateful. And part of that is because I've tried to encourage them and affirm that they have authority given by God and given by me and our board and our church. And I want them to preach with authority because it does make a difference. But I don't think that I did quite as much as when I became the lead pastor. I think that was a transition that I made. Now I say this because the teachers of the law taught more like they had to be careful because they need to make sure that they don't say anything out of turn with regard to this thing that wasn't really theirs, belonged to someone else. Now Jesus came and he taught as if this was his. Now I might argue that Jesus, because he came from the Father and had such an intimate relationship with the Father, is the only one that could teach with the level of authority that he taught. But I might also argue that he wants all of us to teach with that same authority, because we can have the same spirit within us, and therefore we ought to teach with an authority. And I fear that sometimes people teach, this is what this says. Who am I? I don't know much. I'm just, this earthly vessel. It's a balance. We can't be arrogant in declaring God's word, but I do believe we ought to declare it with authority. I do believe we ought to declare it as if it's something that is in us, that comes from the Spirit of God within us, and that he, by his indwelling presence and the anointing that he has put on us, has given us authority to speak his word with boldness. And I think we do God a disservice when we are, I want to call it falsely humble, when we apologize before we start, instead of recognizing the authority of God resting inside of us. So that may be kind of a controversial theological thought, but it is important to balance, because there are people that forget that it's God in them that allows for that authority, and they think that they know something. And so we need to have humility in that. But I do think that there's a difference between true humility, which shines through, shows through. We talked about that in the James Bible study for this same week. And a false humility that denies the power of God in us. And so we got to be careful about that. Number 7 says, how did his parents respond when they found him? They were astonished. That obviously this was not the first place they were looking. And here's Jesus talking to religious leaders. I imagine his parents did not think that it was appropriate for them to go sit down and just have conversations about theology with the religious leaders. And here's a 12-year-old doing that. Letter B, they said, why have you treated us like this? So here's the thing. He had to have known it was 5 days. He had to have assumed that they were going to be looking for him. And yet he was there as if nothing was wrong, talking to not looking for them, not letting everybody know where he was somehow. And so I was thinking about leaving kids. The next questions about this, how Jesus responded and how our kids respond. But 12-year-olds, Brennan is 11 at the time of this recording, and so is that right? Yes. So close to this age, um, mature enough, smart enough to realize that something was wrong if he had been left there for 5 days. You know, I don't know where he slept. I don't know if somebody gave him a place to stay. Um, if he just stayed right there in the courts the whole time. But I also know that kids have a tendency to forget where they are and what's going on. And so it is not uncommon for us to be ready to leave, for everybody in the house to have been preparing to leave. And when we say something about, are you ready? Oh, what time is it? Is it time? And then it's like they were in a different place in a different planet. And so it just doesn't feel like it would be that unusual or surprising for a 12-year-old to zone out and not realize how long it had been, perhaps. But it does seem like after 5 days he'd have figured it out, that something had gone wrong. But he doesn't seem afraid or anything like that. And what I want to talk about here is there's something different about Jesus, but there's something the same about Jesus. And so a part of this is for our theologians and our pastors is something about understanding our Christology, or our theology of Jesus, theological understanding of Christ. And that is that we believe that he is fully God and fully man. And what does it look like to be fully God and fully man? And what parts? So I fear that when we read this story, that a lot of us emphasize the fully God part, and we think about the authority. That's why we assume that he was teaching the teachers and religious leaders, as opposed to them being perhaps just amazed that he was pretty wise for a 12-year-old. It does seem like he wasn't scared. That is probably different than most 12-year-olds. There's something about the trust that he had in God and the comfort that he received being in a place where he knew he should be in the temple. We actually don't know if he was in the temple courts when they left. I think that's what a lot of us kind of assume. Or if he was somewhere else in the city and they wandered and they left him and he went to the temple courts because that's where he knew he would be safe and where he knew he'd be okay. We don't know a lot about that. But I think we haven't thought deeply about this passage because we think about Jesus as fully God, but we forget about him being fully human. And so that's what I want to really talk about during this time. So number 8 says, how did Jesus respond? According to verse 49, he said, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Which, this is one of those things that when he says it, we're like, oh, that's not normal for a normal response for a 12-year-old. CYFD is not going to be recording these Bible studies or logging your answers. But the rest of these questions are meant to bring us into the story. It says, have you ever lost track of your kids for a little while? And I know people that are going to be hearing this, that this is maybe going to be a difficult thing to answer because CYFD has gotten involved and that did happen and something. But probably at some level, most parents have lost track of their kids, at least for a moment, in a place where we thought that they were safe. So we didn't sort of watch them as closely as we might should have. Have you ever had kids that lose track of time and get left? And I don't know if it goes that far very often, but I can't think of a time that we've actually drove off without any of our kids. But when kids just lose track of time, lose track of space, lose track of what's going on in the world outside of whatever is going on in their little brains. Um, and it's easy. I'll tell you, when I was in elementary school, I had an hour and a half bus ride each direction. And I was kind of a bookworm, so I read a lot. That changed as I got older, unfortunately. And then I read more now than I did when I was in the high school and college ages. But I was reading. I would read to pass the time on the bus ride. And I got so into a book one time that when I finally looked up on the bus, there was no one else on the bus, and the driver was back at his house already starting to park the bus for the night. And then I popped up, and he was surprised to see me because he had stopped at my house and I never got off the bus. And he did not realize that I was on the bus. He thought, well, maybe I didn't get on the bus. And so he just moved on, dropped off everybody else, and didn't know until I popped up. So I know that can happen, and kids can just, so one of my thoughts is, what if we don't think of Jesus, seeing his parents here, getting ready to leave, and he says, you know what? Thus saith the Lord, I've got to go to the temple. But what if we stopped and thought, Jesus is 12 years old. Jesus was playing. Jesus was hanging out with friends. Jesus was paying attention to something else, zoning out, and his parents left, and it took him a little bit to realize that they had left. And by the time he realized that they had left, it was more dangerous for him to go out on the road by himself to try to catch up than to stay someplace and find someplace in Jerusalem where he would be safe. And then he went to the temple. And then in the temple, he began, in the temple courts, he probably looked out a place there. Some religious leaders were there and saw a child all by himself, and they sat down to talk to him, and somehow the conversation shifted to theological matters. And this is a very remarkable child. And I'm not saying, because we have so little information from this text, I'm not saying, thus saith the Lord, this is how it happened, and the way you've always thought of it is wrong. What I am saying is, let's consider that Jesus is fully God and fully man. And when he's 12, he's fully boy. And that he had remarkable wisdom for his age, but he was also a boy who messed around and got himself left behind. And not because we see that God the Father told him to stay for 3 more days or 5 more days, but rather because he probably wasn't paying attention, and he zoned out, and then found the best place he could be, the safest place he could be, and went to his father's house. And seemed like that would be the obvious place that they would see. We think of that as a spiritual comment, and maybe it was, because it seems that he called God his father in a different way than God is our father, perhaps. But is it possible that he's saying, where else would I go? Who else would I stay with? What else would I do? This is where I had to go. And anyway, how about for 3 days? I don't, well, in the ministry that we do, it's really possible that somebody has left their children behind for 3 days. And that's unfortunate. But Most of us, that's not been our experience, perhaps. And we've never really left our kids behind for that long, and that would terrify us. If your child, if you, now this is the last thought, if you left your child behind in a town, where would you look for them first? Um, I think most of us would find somebody we knew that their child might reach out to. Most of us might look at, go find the mall, or find a place around the arcade. I don't know. Do they have arcades anymore? Probably not. I'm thinking about my childhood, where I would have gone if I was in a strange town. I would have went to find something that looked familiar, and it probably would have been someplace that I wouldn't mind hanging out for a while. Might have been the place that I hoped my parents would look first. Would it have been the church? Would that be now? Let me say this. This goes back to something we talked about at the beginning, because churches at one point in history, in American history, were the place where anybody would go for help. So it wouldn't be uncommon, perhaps, for a child that had been left behind or something that needed a place to go to a church. Home Alone, in Home Alone, the movie, holiday movie, one of the places he goes, he's in his own house, but he goes to the church and he spends time in the church. And so I I believe that that's not the world we live in anymore. But here's what might determine that. If you spend a lot of time with your kids in a church, then your kids might be more likely to think of that place first as a place that you might go to find them. And so maybe it says more about what our priorities are in our lives, where our kids would end up if they were left behind. Well, this is hypotheticals and thoughts, and it's really intended to try to put us into the story. But let's move on. Number 9. What does verse 51 tell us about Jesus and his relationship with his parents? So here's what I love. He didn't say, didn't you know I had to be here? I have to stay here. One of the other texts for this week in the liturgical calendar is from First Samuel, and has to do with Samuel himself being left at the temple, and being cared for by the priest. But that's not what happened with Jesus. He was left for this period of time, but it says they didn't understand what he was saying. And it says in verse 51, then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And so here's why I think it's important, because we see Jesus responding and respecting his parents and obeying his parents. And Jesus didn't think that he was, I'm already an adult. I'm already, like most 12-year-olds we have already think they know everything. And he is there conversing with religious leaders, but still he went home and didn't stay there, didn't say, well, this is where I belong, I need to stay. He went home and he was obedient to his parents, perhaps even that didn't have the same spiritual understanding as he did. I mean, we don't know that, but perhaps. And he was obedient nonetheless because it was right. What does verse 52 tell us? And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And he grew. So he went home, he obeyed, and he grew. And those are all things that happen when we submit ourselves, when we are obedient, and they don't happen when we are arrogant and believe we know everything. And going back to our thinking about our Christology, it takes away from our thinking that Jesus, Jesus already was smarter than all the religious leaders. So when we're trying to imagine Jesus as fully God and fully man, God doesn't have to grow. If his understanding was already so deep that he was smarter than everybody else, he didn't have to grow. But we see something of Jesus's humanity when when we hear that he grew. He went home, he submitted and obeyed, and he grew. And I think that tells us something about Jesus's humanity. I really think that we need to reread. Now, I know this. I know that there are heretics. There are people in the world that believe Jesus was a great teacher, but they don't believe he was the Son of God. They believe that he was a good person, but they don't believe that he was fully God. I get that. Let's not go that far. Let's not undo all that. But I find that in the church, we also forget that Jesus was fully man. I think in the church, we say, well, that was Jesus, and we put him up on a pedestal, and we don't think we need to sort of model ourselves after him because he was somehow so different from us. And so there's a sense that our theology in the church is tilted because we don't recognize the humanity of Jesus. And so I really think it's important for us to recognize, yes, he was fully God. He came from God. But yes, he was fully man. And we can see some things in this story that remind us that Jesus was a boy. And it would be doing us a disservice in our theology and our understanding of Jesus to assume that he had these godlike characteristics that are not really affirmed necessarily by the story. They're read into the story. So if you think I'm reading in some human characteristics into the story that aren't said in there, and you think that I'm way off base, then let me just present the idea or the thought or the suggestion that you already did the same thing when you read into it these characteristics that you've assigned to Jesus that make him more omnipotent, omnipresent, like God the Father. And you're not recognizing the condescension, the coming down and making himself, becoming flesh that happened, that took away some, that gave up some of those powers. I mean, Jesus, the human that walked this earth, was not all powerful. He needed to eat still. He was not, I believe, although it never tells us specifically, but I believe he was not all knowing. Did he have wisdom beyond his years? Absolutely. Did he have such a relationship with the Father that he seemed to know more than everybody else around him? Absolutely. Did he know people's hearts? It seemed. Yes. Why? Because he had discernment that comes with the Spirit of God that lived inside of him. Was it because he knew what they were thinking in the way that they knew what they were thinking? I don't believe so. I believe that he gave up some of that all when he became a servant and took on flesh. Now, we need to balance that. We need to sort of balance that understanding, and not, if we're going to read into it godlike characteristics, let's also remember the human characteristics, and let's put them together to form who we know that Jesus is. And the last part of this question says, how does this differ from how we often think of Jesus? And I really do believe this. I believe that we often think of Jesus as all God and not as all man. And our theology, and I believe Orthodox Christian theology believes that he was fully God and fully man. That's important.